This is the story of a movie franchise that simply refuses to stay dead. Most film series follow a straight line, consisting of a hit movie, a few sequels, and maybe a reboot. The Universal Soldier saga acts as a chaotic mess of contradictory timelines, ignored sequels, and sudden resurrections. It started as a blockbuster rival to Terminator, before dying a humiliating death on cable television, dying again in theaters, and then miraculously returning from the grave to become one of the most critically acclaimed action series of the modern era. Today, we are dissecting the strange, violent, and confusing history of the franchise that died 3 times, only to come back stronger, stranger, and more violent than ever. In 1992, the action movie industry was shifting. Arnold Schwarzenegger had just changed the game with Terminator 2, and studios were scrambling for the next big sci-fi hit. Carolco Pictures, the powerhouse studio behind Rambo and Total Recall, bet $23 million on a script originally titled Crystal Knights, retooling it into Universal Soldier. The premise was high-concept gold. American soldiers killed in Vietnam are packed in ice, brought back to life 25 years later, and turned into emotionless counter-terrorism machines. It was the perfect vehicle for 2 European martial artists looking to cement their stardom in America, named Jean-Claude Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren. Jean-Claude Van Damme was already a rising star thanks to Bloodsport and Kickboxer, but he needed a mainstream hit. Dolph Lundgren, famous for breaking Rocky Balboa's ribs as Ivan Drago, was looking to break out of the villain mold. Ironically, he was cast as the villain again, as Sergeant Andrew Scott, a soldier who went insane in Vietnam. Van Damme played Luke Devereaux, the hero trying to regain his humanity. The dynamic was electric. Van Damme brought agility and sympathy, while Lundgren brought a terrifying, imposing physicality. Their on-screen rivalry was the heart of the film, but what happened off-screen is what truly sold the movie to the world. In May 1992 at the Cannes Film Festival, the red carpet was packed with press when the 2 stars of Universal Soldier were suddenly in each other's faces. They were shoving, shouting, and looking ready to brawl right there in their tuxedos, until bodyguards had to pull them apart. The media went into a frenzy. Headlines screamed about a bitter rivalry between the 2 action titans. It was perfect publicity, and it was completely fake. Van Damme had cooked up the idea to generate buzz, realizing they needed a scandal to compete with the bigger stars. It worked! The movie opened to over $100 million worldwide, launching a franchise, just as the studio collapsed. By 1995, Carolco Pictures was bankrupt, a casualty of massive flops like Cutthroat Island. The rights to Universal Soldier were sold off in a fire sale to a Canadian production company. This marked the franchise's first death. Instead of a big-budget theatrical sequel with Van Damme, we got a pair of low-budget television movies produced for Showtime in 1998. Titled Brothers in Arms and Unfinished Business, these films were intended to be a backdoor pilot for a TV series that never happened. The biggest problem was that the stars were gone. Van Damme and Lundgren were nowhere to be seen, replaced by actors you probably have never heard of. Taking over the role of Luke Devereaux was Matt Battaglia, a former NFL linebacker turned actor. While physically imposing, he lacked Van Damme's charisma and martial arts background. The plot was a direct continuation of the first movie, but it felt like a hollow shell. To add some star power, the producers hired Burt Reynolds to play a CIA mentor, and the eccentric Gary Busey as the villain. Busey improvised wild dialogue, true to form, but even his chaotic energy couldn't save these films. They were cheap, shot in Canada to save money, and suffered from the 90s cable TV aesthetic of flat lighting and stiff action. The 2 TV movies Brothers in Arms and Unfinished Business were released just weeks apart. The reception was non-existent. Fans of the original felt cheated by the lack of Van Damme. The violence was toned down for television, stripping away the gritty edge that made the 1992 film work. The promised TV series was quietly canceled, and for a moment it seemed like Universal Soldier was destined to be forgotten in the bargain bin of history. But Hollywood loves a name brand, and in 1999, Sony Pictures decided to pretend these TV movies never happened. They wanted the real Luke Devereaux back, setting the stage for the franchise's second death. Universal Soldier: The Return arrived in theaters in August 1999. The the marketing proudly announced that Jean-Claude Van Damme was back. The script completely ignored the Canadian TV movies, establishing a new timeline where Luc Devereaux had been cured of being a Unisol. He was now a normal human, a technical advisor for the government, and a single father. The villain this time wasn't a soldier, but a supercomputer named Seath that controlled a new army of muscular goons. If that sounds like Skynet from Terminator, that is because it was a blatant ripoff. But this time, the magic was gone. To bolster the cast, the filmmakers turned to the world of professional wrestling. Bill Goldberg, then at the height of his WCW fame, was cast as Romeo, a seemingly unstoppable Unisol. Michael Jai White, a legitimate martial artist, played the physical embodiment of the evil computer. On paper, the action should have been spectacular. In reality, the movie was a cartoon. It featured heavy metal soundtracks, cheesy one-liners, and a tone that felt more like a video game than a war movie. Van Damme looked bored, the plot made zero sense, and the critics absolutely destroyed it. It holds a painful 5% rating on Rotten Tomatoes for a reason. If you are enjoying this deep exploration of action movie history, hit subscribe and the notification bell as we dissect franchises like this every week. Now we will see how this movie killed the franchise. The box office numbers for The Return were a disaster. On a budget estimated between $20 and $40 million, it grossed just over $10 million in the US. It didn't just fail, it bombed. This was the second death of the franchise. Theatrical doors slammed shut. Van Damme's career as a major box office draw took a massive hit, sending him into the world of direct-to-video films for the next decade. Universal Soldier was now considered a toxic asset. It had failed on TV, and it had failed in theaters. For 10 long years, the franchise lay dormant, as a relic of the 90s that nobody wanted to touch. Throughout the 2000s, action cinema was evolving. The Bourne Identity introduced shaky cam and realism, while The Matrix brought wire fu. Universal Soldier, with its muscle-bound titans, felt like a dinosaur. During this decade, Van Damme was making movies like In Hell and Wake of Death, smaller, grittier films where he actually started to prove he could act. Meanwhile, Dolph Lundgren was directing his own projects. The idea of reuniting them seemed impossible, especially for a franchise that had already embarrassed itself twice. But in 2009, a new director named John Hyams entered the picture with a vision that would change everything. When Universal Soldier Regeneration was announced as a direct-to-video sequel, everyone rolled their eyes, expecting another cheap cash grab. But John Hyams, the son of legendary director Peter Hyams, wasn't interested in making a cheap sequel. He wanted to make a war movie. Filmed in Bulgaria in the dead of winter, Regeneration stripped away the cheese, the comedy, and the bright colors. It was gray, industrial, and bleak. And most importantly, it performed the franchise's second retcon. It completely ignored the Return. In this new timeline, Luc Devereaux wasn't a happy father, but a broken shell of a man, decommissioned and struggling to function in society. Hyams knew that Van Damme and Lundgren were older now, so he introduced a new threat known as the Next Generation Unisol, played by former UFC heavyweight champion Andre the Pitbull Arlovsky. Arlovsky didn't have many lines, but he was terrifying. He moved with the speed and brutality of a modern MMA fighter rather than a 90s kickboxer. The fight scenes were a revelation. No shaky cam or quick cuts were used. They relied on long, wide takes of brutal, bone-crunching violence. The story centered on terrorists taking over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a grim setting that matched the film's nihilistic tone perfectly. What shocked critics most was Jean-Claude Van Damme's performance. He barely speaks in the film. His character, Luke, is dragged back into service against his will, looking tired, sad, and old. It was a meta-commentary on Van Damme's own career as an aging action star forced to fight again and again for our entertainment. When he finally unleashes violence, it is not triumphant, but tragic. And then there was Dolph Lundgren. His character, Andrew Scott, was cloned and brought back, but he wasn't the cartoon villain from 1992. He was confused, damaged, and essentially a Frankenstein's monster, wondering why he was alive. Regeneration was released with zero fanfare, but word of mouth spread quickly. Action aficionados and serious film critics began to praise it as one of the best action movies of the year. It was compared to the works of James Cameron and John Carpenter. It was a direct-to-video movie that looked better than most theatrical releases. It proved that the franchise wasn't dead, but had just been sleeping, waiting for a director who took the premise seriously. By ignoring the failures of the past, Hyams had resurrected the brand, but he wasn't done yet. He was about to take things even further, into the heart of darkness. 3 years later, in 2012, came Universal Soldier: Day of Reckoning. If Regeneration was a gritty war movie, Day of Reckoning was a psychological horror film. It opens with a POV shot of a home invasion. We see through the eyes of a man named John as his wife and daughter are executed. The killer reveals his face, and it is Jean-Claude Van Damme. The hero of the franchise was now the villain. This was a bold, confusing, and terrifying choice. The movie follows John, played by Scott Adkins, as he hunts down Van Damme in a story that owes more to Apocalypse Now and David Lynch than to traditional action movies. Scott Adkins, arguably the best Western martial artist working today, took the lead role of John. His journey is a descent into madness. As he searches for Luke Devereaux, he encounters a cult of Unisols living off the grid. The movie is bathed in strobe lights, hypnotic colors, and a droning, dread-inducing soundtrack. It was the first film in the series shot in 3D, and Hyams used it to make the violence pop in disturbing ways. This wasn't a fun popcorn movie. It was a brutal examination of identity, memory, and the cycle of violence. It was art house cinema disguised as a B-movie. In this film, Luke Devereaux has become a Colonel Kurtz figure, bald and face-painted, leading a rebellion against the government that created him. He wants to free the Universal Soldiers from their programming. Van Damme plays the role with a haunting stillness. He is no longer the hero, but a myth, a ghost haunting the narrative. When the final confrontation between Scott Adkins and Van Damme arrives, it isn't a triumphant duel. It acts as a ritualistic slaughter where the torch is passed in blood. By the time the credits roll, the original era of Universal Soldier is definitively and violently over. Day of Reckoning is widely considered the masterpiece of the franchise. Critics called it miraculous and the best action movie of the year, and yet this marked the third death of the franchise. Since 2012, there has not been another Universal Soldier movie. Perhaps Hyams pushed the concept as far as it could go? He deconstructed the heroes, turned them into villains, and then killed them, leaving nowhere left to go. The franchise didn't die because it failed. This time, it died because it completed its mission. It ended on a creative high note that few series ever achieved. Now, in 2026, the franchise remains dormant. Over the years, there have been whispers. In 2018, screenwriter Richard Wenk, known for The Equalizer, claimed he was writing a reimagining that would focus on a single soldier, stripping away the duo dynamic. But years have passed, and that script seems to have vanished into development hell. Occasional fan trailers like the Dominion concept that floated around online spark brief excitement, but they are just mirages. Jean-Claude Van Damme is now 65 years old. The era of the original Unisols is truly gone. The studio sits on the IP, unsure how to restart a machine that has already evolved into something so strange. We care about Universal Soldier because it is a perfect case study in how franchises survive. It survived bankruptcy, bad casting, and box office bombs. It survived by mutating. It started as a mainstream blockbuster, turned into cheap TV filler, morphed into a cheesy sci-fi comedy, and finally evolved into avant-garde action horror. It proves that no intellectual property is ever truly dead if a filmmaker has a bold enough vision to reinvent it. John Hyams didn't just make sequels, he took a broken toy and turned it into a piece of modern art. If you want to watch this series today, you have to choose your own adventure. You can watch the official theatrical timeline, which goes from the original to the return and ends in disappointment. You can watch the cable TV timeline, which goes from the original to the Canadian sequels and ends in boredom. Or you can watch the Hyams timeline. The original film followed immediately by Regeneration and Day of Reckoning. This is the path I recommend. It tells a complete tragic story of soldiers used by their government until they lose their souls. It is a trilogy that accidentally happened over 20 years. We must give credit to Dolph Lundgren. While Van Damme was the face of the franchise, Lundgren was its soul. In every iteration, his character Andrew Scott steals the show. In the first film, he's terrifyingly funny. In Regeneration, he's heartbreakingly confused. In Day of Reckoning, he's a charismatic cult leader. Lundgren proved he was more than just a chemically enhanced Russian boxer. He was a genuinely versatile actor who understood the absurdity and the tragedy of the Universal Soldier concept better than anyone. Without his recurring presence, the resurrections would never have worked. Universal Soldier also helped break the stigma of direct-to-video. Before Regeneration, DTV meant garbage, where washed-up stars went to cash paychecks. But Hyams showed that DTV could offer creative freedom that theatrical releases couldn't. Without the pressure of box office opening weekends or studio interference, he could make a slow, moody, violent film that mass audiences might hate, but genre fans would adore. This paved the way for the current era of action cinema, where some of the best stunt work and choreography happens on streaming services and VOD, rather than in the multiplex. Will Universal Soldier rise for a fourth time? Hollywood is obsessed with existing IP, so it is almost inevitable, but a simple remake wouldn't work. The magic of this franchise was its specific history, consisting of the baggage of Van Damme and Lundgren, the weird twists, and the accumulated lore. A shiny new reboot with young actors would likely feel just like the TV movies did in 1998. The only way forward would be to embrace the madness again. Perhaps a story about the children of the Unisols, or a full dive into the sci-fi horror that Hyams established. But for now, the soldiers are back on ice. It is rare for a franchise to peak at part 4 and 5. Usually, returns diminish. Rocky V was worse than Rocky, and Jaws the Revenge was a joke. Universal Soldier defied gravity. The first movie was good fun. The middle movies were terrible, and the final movies were masterpieces of their genre. It followed an inverted trajectory, getting smarter, darker, and more artistic as it got older and cheaper to make. It is proof that budget doesn't equal quality, vision equals quality. And sometimes, you have to die a few times to find your true identity. Universal Soldier is more than just a series of action movies. It's a survival story. It weathered bankruptcy, bad sequels, and the changing tides of Hollywood to emerge as a cult classic. It teaches us that even when something looks dead, buried by critics and box office numbers, there is always a chance for regeneration if the right creative spark is applied. The soldiers might be fictional, but the franchise's resilience is very real. If you enjoyed this journey through the chaotic timeline of the Unisols, make sure to subscribe for more deep explorations of the strange corners of cinema history.